Welcome to the Total Soccer Show. I am your host, Taylor Rockwell. Joining me this evening, or I should say tonight, it's evening, it's Sunday night, is Joseph Lowery, at Joe and Cleats on Twitter, also writes for The Athletic, does great stuff when it comes to U.S. national team, and for the purposes of this conversation, does great stuff when it comes to Americans playing abroad. That's what we're going to be talking about. We talk a lot up front about the players playing in Germany in the Bundesliga, and where some of those players might fit within Greg Berhalter's national team system, but there's also Wales, Scotland, England, the Netherlands, Belgium. We're all over the place. I think there's some France in there. We've got lots of countries, lots of players playing all over the place. So this is sort of our attempt, I should say, to look at a few of those players, look at kind of how it's been for them or what their current state is with those clubs, and then maybe how they'll fit into Berhalter's system, if they fit into Berhalter's system, or even if they'll be considered by U.S. coach Greg Berhalter. So I hope it's a very useful conversation. If you can't watch, the 17 or 18 games that are being played over the weekend, then Joe's got you covered. He's got some good updates, some good insights, some good analysis of the players' strengths and weaknesses. So I will stop with the introductions and instead say, joining me once again, I've got Joseph Lowery, The Athletic's Joseph Lowery, to give him his full billing. Joseph, thank you very much for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Taylor.
Of course. I wanted to have you back on because I wanted to talk a little bit Americans abroad, because I was reading The Athletic last week and I came across an article entitled Projecting How Europe-Based USMNTers Will Fit into Berhalter's System, or fit into, not even will fit, but just already are fitting into, which I believe was written by you. So that gives me the idea that you've been watching a fair amount of the Americans based in Europe. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. I think I probably watched more than most. Not more than everybody, but definitely more than the average guy.
All right. So basically, we wanted to have you on to just kind of pick your brain about lots of different Americans. We probably will not get to them all because there are many, but I wanted to start in the Bundesliga, and I wanted to start with Tyler Adams. Even though he did not play this weekend, they drew with, 0-0 with Eintracht Frankfurt. I'm wondering if you've been surprised by how quickly he appears to have integrated into that Leipzig squad.
I don't think I have been surprised. I guess I've been a little bit, now that I say that, I guess I've been a little bit surprised at the amount of minutes he's been receiving so early on, but I think that's probably boils down to injuries and just Adams being the next guy on the depth chart more than anything else. But, I don't want to sell him short. He's fit in really well, and I think that's a credit to the Red Bull system in general and how many of the principles that Leipzig use are evident when the New York Red Bulls play as well. So I think the whole organization has done themselves a real service by making their teams play similarly and allowing them to move these talented young players from one rung of the ladder up to the next.
And does Jesse Marsch factor into that as well, since he seems to be able to move from one team to the next as well?
I mean, I think so. I think, if you're referencing Marsch's potential move to Salzburg, I think he could fit in really well there. It's a great opportunity for him. I think he's probably eased Adams' transition to Leipzig a little bit, and now he's got a chance to go and make a transition of his own yet again. So I think he'll be almost, I don't want to say a trailblazer because there have been other American managers in Europe, but I think Marsch has a great opportunity to go to Salzburg and to really make an impact, maybe even in the Champions League.
And going back to your article that you wrote, where do you see Tyler Adams fitting into Berhalter's system in that? Because we talked a little bit about him potentially playing as that right back, or if it continues to be the Nick Lima sort of charging into the middle and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if you think maybe he could go there, or if you see him fitting in more centrally.
That's the question, isn't it? I think that Adams is a good fit for that Nick Lima role. If we see that to be a fixture in the future for Berhalter's national team, I think that's absolutely a spot where he could excel at. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I think Adams also could do quite well as a central midfielder, as a full-time central midfielder in that role. He's improving his passing game a little bit every single time I see him play. I do have some questions about how his offensive game will develop at Leipzig, because we see him, win balls and tackle and really get deep into the midfield and win plays like that. And then we see him, play a pass really quickly right after he wins it. We don't necessarily see him have to really play too much of a demanding role when he gets the ball. So I think maybe at some point in the future, if we see Adams move on from Leipzig to a team that doesn't always play that quick attacking, very transitionally dependent game. I think we could see Adams' passing improve. That maybe would help elevate him and his overall skill set to eventually play central midfield in the future. But basically, the answer is I think he could fit both places. Where Berhalter will choose to play him, I don't know.
You mentioned that passing ability. I wanted to ask you this as well. What are the things that you think could potentially hold Tyler Adams back from like really cementing that starting spot with RB Leipzig, or like continuing to move on from there? What does he really need to work on, in your opinion?
You know, it's so hard because every time I've seen Adams play, he's done, I don't want to say exceptionally well, but he's done very, very well. I think when you look at the big midfielder that Leipzig is missing, I think, is Kevin Campbell. I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce his name. And he's got a certain quality on the ball that I don't think Adams has yet. So Adams can perform all the defensive duties and the work rate and the pressing, maybe even better than the other midfielders that Leipzig has on the squad. But I think if Adams probably wants to get that full-time starting spot, he might have to infuse a little bit more creativity into his play, which kind of goes counter to what I was just saying. But I think Adams right now has found himself in a really good position with his performances kind of happening into a starting and then doing really well with them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, another player who you said you think is a clear positional fit in that article was Weston McKennie. Why do you think he fits so well with what Greg Berhalter wants to do?
It's hard. It's hard because Schalke are not a mess. I mean,
yeah,
they still have some.
That's fair. No, you can call them a mess.
Yeah,
don't worry.
Yeah, okay, so Schalke are kind of a mess, which makes it hard to really get a feel for how McKennie's doing and what he's good at. But I feel comfortable enough in what I've seen from him in the past, especially even at times this season. He likes to position himself, or Tedesco is telling him to position himself between the lines when he's playing as sort of like an advanced midfielder, or whatever you want to call that role that Schalke has him playing in sometimes. But I think that McKennie's positioning is good, and it's had to be good for Schalke this season because they need any offensive boost they can get. But McKennie's positioning is good, his skill on the ball is good, and his ability to turn with the ball, I think, is his ability to turn with the ball and run, almost like we saw Christian Roldan do a few times in those two friendlies, I think is probably better than most other midfielders in the pool. So I think he really will be a good fit in that advanced midfield role, or I guess it's a central midfield role really for the U.S. In whatever fashion Berhalter decides to play him in. And
you may have already answered this, but just to clarify, why do you think it is then that he's being moved around so much with Schalke? Is it just that he can play a variety of positions, or is it like a specific skill set he has that Tedesco is trying to utilize in different areas?
I think it's both. I think Tedesco wants to get him on the field because McKennie's skill set is versatile and seems to fit Schalke's weird mishmash of style, I guess you could say. I mean, he can press high up the field as a forward and win balls and win duels if and when Schalke play long, or he can drop deeper into midfield and win a tackle, or step to the ball and then play quick passes forward out of that. Or, he can start out wide and make a run inside. We've seen him, I can't remember if that was a goal. It was an assist to Caligiuri a couple of weeks ago that he had a great run leading up to that play. And then, if they needed extra defender, McKennie can slide in there too. He's good in the air. He can win balls. He's strong, and he can pass well. So his skill set kind of fits basically anywhere in the style that Schalke plays. So I think that's probably why.
And he did have the assist in there for the lone goal in their 3-1 loss to Bayern this weekend. For you, though, do you have concerns about him being utilized everywhere? In that, is it possible that maybe he just keeps developing different skills because he's playing a variety of positions, or is it possible that he maybe doesn't develop as much because he's not kind of consistently starting in the same spot every week?
I think it definitely hurts McKennie to not be given a consistent role. I think we see his skill set sort of translate, like I was saying, to different spots on the field, but it doesn't allow him to develop, like you were saying, Taylor. It doesn't allow him to develop in a certain spot and really hone his craft in one position. If he projects as a central midfielder, like I think most people probably think he does, it's unfortunate that he's having to spend time either at the top end of the field and as a forward, or way back sometimes defending. I think he just played as a defender in a second half of a game recently, or for 20 or 30 minutes, whatever it is. So it doesn't allow him to have that continuity that a lot of other young players do get. But I think McKennie's good enough and he's talented enough and he's smart enough that ultimately he'll still develop. It is a little bit unfortunate.
Actually, like, maybe this is a much bigger question, so forgive me if it ends up being a bit rambly, but I'm realizing that a lot of the questions I have about Americans in the Bundesliga are sort of tied to their either lack of minutes or lack of consistent minutes or lack of like consistent positions. Do you think does that give you concern at all that because in addition to the ones we've already talked about, there's Pulisic, there's Josh Sargent, there's Bobby Wood, there's other ones in there who like maybe are sort of in strange positions right now with their clubs. Do you think that's the case, or am I just being a little bit overly sensitive because I like the national team so much?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you go down the list of the guys you just mentioned.
Reassuring, but then not reassuring that I'm right. But then I'm also right. Yeah.
I mean, you go down the list. You got Bobby Wood, who's not really scoring goals, and he's stuck on a relegation battling team, and he's only playing a little bit here and there. And then you've got McKennie, who's playing anywhere and everywhere for Schalke without any consistency. Pulisic, who's stuck in this weird transfer limbo, wouldn't even be starting anyway with Sancho, and then Sargent coming off the bench, I guess, for Werder Bremen. So I think we are in this little bit of a weird situation where these guys, a lot of them, we think will play big roles with the national team, are in somewhat difficult situations with their club teams. And I think in McKennie's case, ultimately he is getting minutes, so that's a little bit of a moral victory in a way. But yeah, I think it absolutely is a fair point, and I guess I'm not concerned about it necessarily, but it's definitely worth talking about.
All right, well then let's keep talking about it. But let's go maybe slightly more optimistic here. Let's start with Josh Sargent, for example. 7 appearances this season, 2 goals, but only 122 minutes, which my math tells me is about 17 minutes a game. Sometimes more than that, generally fewer than that. Do you think it's realistic for him to maybe move into more of a starting position, getting more minutes next season? Or what do you think he needs to sort of make that happen in the next 6 months or so?
I think you're spot on. I think we could probably see him start to maybe factor into a more featured role next season. I'm kind of personally expecting Sargent to get a start before the season ends. I don't feel that's too high of a bar. Bremen are still in the DFB Pokal, so they've got some extra games as well. So I think Sargent, if he stays in his sort of bench scoring role, which for a young American attacker in the Bundesliga is not anything to be ashamed at or to stick your nose up at. I think he's still an important role for Bremen. So Sargent definitely factoring more into the first choice 11 next season is sort of my own expectation for him.
And what do you think? Is there anything specifically he needs to do to make that happen, or is it just kind of keep grinding, taking advantage of the minutes he can? Or again, are there any sort of shortcomings that you think he could maybe be putting extra work on in training?
It sounds kind of cliche, but I think you're right. He needs to continue to show, or he needs to start, I should say, showing almost unreal consistency in his limited substitution minutes, because I think that's kind of the only path to getting starts this season, which then will translate into next season, hopefully. Because I think Sargent is still a little bit, and it's not unexpected or anything like that. He's still a little bit inconsistent with his game. It's hard as a young striker as well trying to break into a team because, especially when you're not getting a lot of opportunities and a lot of minutes, every single touch you have is so important. And it's you only get the ball a few times in your limited appearance. So I think for Sargent, just trying to continue to be consistent. His game is so well rounded. It's hard for me to really pinpoint anything specific that he needs to improve on necessarily to get into that starting 11, but I think just being consistent in his substitution appearances will go a long way.
That makes sense to me. And I think it's also maybe the case for me that I'm just a little bit more nervous about Sargent specifically because coming out of the January camp, looking at the kind of striker options, it's a little bit bleak, and that goes to MLS players. But then looking at some players based in Europe, like Bobby Wood is the one that most readily comes to mind. Although he is still getting minutes, he played for Hanover this weekend. They won 2-0. They're still in the relegation zone. It still feels to me like I guess I kind of keep feeling like maybe he needs a move, maybe to Major League Soccer to kind of kickstart his career. But I'm not even sure he necessarily needs to kickstart it. So. What have you made of Bobby Wood this season, and what do you think? I guess, do you think he needs a move, or do you think he's doing okay and just needs to kind of stick with a club for a little bit longer?
I think maybe at this point, Bobby Wood is what Bobby Wood is, and I'll kind of expand on that a little bit. It seems to me that Bobby Wood is always this kind of either first or second, maybe rotation striker on this relegation-threatened team in the Bundesliga. I think a move could be a really good thing for him. But at the same time, if he wants to stay in Germany and play in the Bundesliga, that's fine. And maybe that's just what he is at this point in his career. So I think it's entirely possible that he ends up being this sort of, I don't know how hardworking of a player he is, but I think he might end up being this, plausible fit into any US 11. If we really need a striker for a game, he might not always be first choice. But, I suppose he's a decent enough depth option. But going back to sort of where you started that off, I think a move to MLS could be really good for him. Not only do I think he would be good in MLS, but it could do wonders for his confidence, and actually seeing the ball go in the net for Bobby Wood would have to feel good.
Well, so then let me ask you this then. Like, with the idea of like Bobby Wood is who Bobby Wood is, like, how would you describe him? If an alien landed here and for whatever reason specifically asked you who is Bobby Wood and how would you describe him as a player, like what would you say to clearly convey like who Bobby Wood is, but maybe also what the issue might be with him right now?
So he's not a glamorous guy. He's not like a prolific goal scorer. At least that's been my impression of him. He's kind of the guy who gets the job done. Oh, I'm just throwing out all the cliches here. But he's disciplined enough defensively. He's capable of moving wide, either in build up or making runs between the fullback, the outside fullback, and then one of the center backs. So I think he's pretty versatile in his ability in possession. I don't think he's necessarily great at anything on the ball or in possession, or even great at anything defensively, but he's decent enough at everything to make him somewhat valuable to a team. So I'm not sure if that's going to really help our alien overlords, but I think that's sort of my impression of Bobby Wood. Not that I've actually seen a ton of him in his Bundesliga teams recently, but that's my general feel for him.
So if you had to like pick a starting 11 right now, say the US is playing with like one forward up top, would it be Wood? Would it be Sargent? Would it be Altidore? Would it be Novakovic or Zardes or somebody else? Who would you play as that central striker right now?
It still would be Altidore, I think. Bobby Wood would probably be the next guy down, just because I do think he can, enter cliche, get the job done. Sargent also is a good option. Altidore, I think still has to the national team and still will have value for the national team under Berhalter.
Much, much more from my conversation with Joseph Lowery in just a moment. But first, I needed to let you know that today's episode of the Total Soccer Show is brought to you by SeatGeek, our old pals over at SeatGeek. Getting tickets online can be far too complicated with hundreds of sites and varying levels of reliability. It's hard to know who to trust. That's why SeatGeek is the way to go. A few years ago, my dad used a different site to buy tickets to I think, comedy show. The tickets ended up being like 17 times what they should have cost, and weren't even real. So that's not really the ideal outcome, but that will not be an issue when you purchase tickets from SeatGeek. They pull millions of tickets into one place so you can easily find the seats you want for a price you're willing to pay. So that means you can make SeatGeek your go-to ticket source for everything from sports and concerts to comedy and theater. And with that in mind, well, specifically the sports part in mind, if, say, you wanted to follow up on some of the players we're talking about, maybe see them play for the U.S. national team, you might be able to do that on March 21st in Orlando when the United States plays Ecuador, or on March 26th in Houston when the USA plays Chile. So you could get tickets now to those games on SeatGeek. You could also get tickets to some Gold Cup games. The ones in Minnesota and Cleveland are all ready for sale on SeatGeek, and you can know if they're going to be good values because they have the color-coded system that tells you if it's a good value, it's green, bad value, bright red, so you know, ooh, that's going to be too expensive, that doesn't quite fit with what I want, but the green ones definitely will. Best of all, our listeners can get $10 off their first SeatGeek purchase. Just download the SeatGeek app and enter the promo code TSS today. That's promo code TSS for $10 off your first SeatGeek purchase. Remember, folks, SeatGeek, life's an event. We have the tickets. And if you're looking for a ticket to understand the U.S. national team and all of the many players that play for that team but play abroad, then Joseph Lowery has you covered. Let's get back to my conversation with Joe. All right, so we're gonna go out the door to start. Maybe Wood, but maybe Sargent just pushing up. I do want to talk Novakovic in a little bit, but first I want to talk about a player who might be supplying them with some opportunities. Christian Pulisic, who did not get any minutes, I believe, in Dortmund's 3-3 draw with Hoffenheim, which itself was a bit of a disaster since they were up 3-0. I do find myself, though I keep trying to talk myself into he's already agreed to the move to Chelsea, so they're going to use Dortmund. Are you going to use him sparingly? They're going to develop other players. I do find myself getting increasingly nervous about his lack of consistent starts and consistent minutes. And that was one that I really didn't buy into it when it first started happening. I was like, oh, he's still getting plenty of minutes. He's still appearing here and there. But it feels like the more it goes on, the more I do get concerned. So do you think I'm overreacting? Do you think he still fits in at Dortmund, or are you looking forward to him at Chelsea? So given that they just got destroyed today, I'm not sure if anyone's looking forward to anything with Chelsea, but you take my point.
Yeah, Pulisic's in a little bit of a rough situation at the moment. He's not playing for Dortmund, and who knows what's happening over at Chelsea. But I personally am still not, and this might be the wrong take, I'm still not really concerned about Pulisic at Dortmund. It was never necessarily my impression that he was going to get a ton of minutes. I thought he still would get minutes, and I think he still will get some. But yeah, I guess I'm not worried, just because Dortmund are somehow still in first place in the Bundesliga. They're playing some really good soccer. They're in the champion. They still have plenty of fixtures. Mm-hmm. And so I guess if we look back after the season ends and Pulisic rarely sees the field outside of maybe 10-minute substitution cameos at the end of Bundesliga games against some of the bottom feeders, then at that point I look and say, yeah, that's not good. That's probably a wasted opportunity in terms of his ability to get on the field and make impactful development for the career of a young player. So I think right now I'm still doing all right with Pulisic, but I absolutely see where you're coming from.
Well, this is, and part of it, this one is less hypothetical than the alien one, but I was trying to explain Pulisic to my wife this weekend, as you do, and I found myself really struggling to be able to explain, because she was like, oh, so he's the one who's moving for all that money, right? And I was like, yeah, but he's still with his German club. That took some explaining. And then she was like, well, but then why isn't he playing if he's so expensive? And I was like, well, there's tactics and there's fixes. I couldn't really give her a good answer. So if you were answering that question, do you think there's one thing that is sort of causing problems or holding him back from starting? I mean, is it just how good Jadon Sancho has been?
I think it definitely is a lot of how good Jadon Sancho has been. And then, Rafael Guerreiro and Larson on that other wing have also been decent enough. I mean, they're both talented players, obviously. But Pulisic, he shows flashes still. He's still not this, uber consistent young player. Not that, we really expect him to be. He's this, this winger that thrives on confidence and dribbles and takes people on, and sometimes is in great form, and sometimes really just looks kind of not good when he's playing. So I think that just the style of player he is, that's so dependent on confidence and on form, makes it difficult for Dortmund to roll him out there and start him when they really need 3 points in the Bundesliga. Although that draw with Hoffenheim, maybe that's not going so well for them anyway. Yeah. But I think Pulisic's general style as a player and his age and just his skill set all sort of combined to make it difficult for him to actually get starts.
But he did get that start in the DFB Pokal against Werder Bremen, which they ended up losing or failing to advance on, I think, because of penalties. I could have that wrong. There you go. But with that, he did have the one really great run under pressure, at least one very good run that I remember, which had some people wondering if maybe Greg Berhalter might look to use him as a number 10. Where did you have Pulisic fitting in, or where do you think he fits in within the Berhalter system?
Yeah, I'd also thought about Pulisic sort of slotting in as one of those advanced central midfielders for Berhalter. I think Pulisic fits both the winger profile we've seen from Berhalter and then also the midfield one as well. He's comfortable on the ball. He can turn in central midfield. I think he's not the best passer, but at the same time, I'm not sure. I mean, Roldan did have some passing chances, as did Mihailovic, but I think I don't know exactly how important distribution is from those roles necessarily. So I think Pulisic could fit in centrally or really threaten some back lines with his creativity and his speed out wide. So I think we could see him almost in any of the attacking spots.
All right, and I'm assuming we'll be seeing John Brooks starting at center back. That one seems pretty nailed on. And it's also worth noting that he is, I think, one of the few Americans who you could say is getting those consistent minutes we don't have to worry so much about. But there have been concerns about Wolfsburg in seasons past. So overall, do you think that move from Hertha to Wolfsburg, it's been a year and a half now. I think he started 20 of 21 games. Like, do you think that move was the right move for him to kind of cement his status with the U.S. national team and kind of increase his ability within the Bundesliga?
I think so. I think Wolfsburg this season, from when I've watched them, they're a good team. They're actually enjoyable to watch. Brooks as a player is one of my favorites to watch. Just his work on the ball is always so aesthetically pleasing. But I'm not the one who makes the national team roster choices, actually, so that doesn't really answer your question.
No, actually, but we can pause there because I want to know, like, what is it exactly that you enjoy so much about watching him?
He's always so comfortable on the ball. Okay, I'm going to stop there with a caveat of saying I think he just lost the ball for Wolfsburg and cost them a goal this past weekend. But, if we sort of all of his mistakes that he's ever made and just focus on the good stuff, he can be really fun to watch. He's such a good passer. He's often clean on the ball.
You can use absolutes. It's fine. Go ahead. Don't worry about it. It's fine.
He's always perfect on the ball. He's always clean. No, he can split lines with his passing and get the ball up into the attack with one kick basically. He can even carry the ball forward, which is something that I'm always excited about when I see center backs try and dribble forward and bypass defenders and do stuff we don't usually see center backs do even now. So overall, I'm just a big fan of Brooks and his offensive ability and his skill in possession and what that brings to a team and the benefits that it brings to a team like Wolfsburg, and then maybe even in the national team under Berhalter.
All right. So we've talked about a lot of Bundesliga players. There are obviously Americans playing in other leagues, but I have one more American in the Bundesliga to ask about. Alfredo Morales has been making regular appearances for Fortuna Dusseldorf. Whew, that one's hard to say. Why do you think he's a player who doesn't get many looks at international level? I think his last one was in May of 2016. Why do you think that is? And is there a chance we see him with Berhalter, or is it going to be more the established names that we'll see for the foreseeable future?
I mean, there's absolutely a chance we see him with Berhalter. I'm guessing, if Berhalter is seriously considering bringing him in, he's watched more of Morales than I have, and probably than most of us have. Personally, I'm not super familiar with Morales just because he hasn't been, like you were saying, hasn't been in the conversation for call-ups recently, and I frankly don't know why that is. I don't know how clean he is on the ball. So he might not be the best fit for a Berhalter team, but then again, I even really make that assessment because I just haven't seen as much of him, and I haven't seen much of Dusseldorf. So that's a big question mark for me, honestly.
Yeah, I think it becomes a weird, like, self-fulfilling thing where he doesn't get called in, so then he stops being a player that you kind of keep an eye on, and then as that continues to be the case, you keep less and less of an eye on. And I think we've had a few tweets about him, and I've seen a few different posts about, like, why does he never get any looks, and I don't really have a satisfactory answer. So maybe I'll just have to watch more Fortuna Dusseldorf and see what happens. We could both do that, or we could move our attention to the rest of Europe. Where would you like to go? I think we've got England, the Netherlands, Scotland still to come. Any particular place you want to land?
Oh, let's get DeAndre Yedlin out of the way, shall we?
Okay. I would like to go there because Daryl and I have been very critical of him, especially lately, to the extent that we're thinking he might not necessarily end up being a starter under Berhalter. Where are you on Yedlin currently?
Yeah, so I'm much more with you and Daryl in terms of my take on Yedlin, and I've taken plenty of flack for that on recently, but that's fine. We deal with that on the daily.
So, okay, let's put it this way then. What do you think it is that has gone wrong for him, or why do you think it is necessarily that he doesn't fit with what Berhalter is going to be looking for? So I touched on this in the piece that I wrote for The Athletic, projecting how these European guys could fit in March or, whenever Berhalter calls them in. And, I think we can agree that Yedlin doesn't necessarily fit either of those, positional profiles we've seen from Berhalter. But that's not to say that we couldn't see Berhalter change up his rotation a little bit and have Yedlin maybe go up and down that right side. Mm-hmm. One of the tens, I guess it would be Roldan if you're trying to imagine it. If you're listening to this, Roldan maybe drop a little bit deeper into midfield, and then that right winger can tuck into where the was. Mm-hmm. So it's the nice thing about Berhalter's system and his spacing is that you can rotate players and they do rotate within the game, so the spacing is still maintained. But I can't help but wonder, is Yedlin actually worth
is Yedlin the guy worth changing the system for?
Yeah.
Is he actually good enough to warrant adjusting? I think we obviously will see Berhalter adjust the system in the future. You can't necessarily just roll out the same lineup with the same style in every game against every opponent. But I don't know if Yedlin is worth it. Maybe Pulisic is worth it. Maybe even worth it in changing up how Berhalter uses his striker. Mm-hmm. But I guess I would have to watch more of Yedlin and really try to pay attention to see if he would warrant sort of an adjustment on that right side and how Berhalter uses his team.
I'm with you, and of all the players we've talked about, he might be the one that I try to focus on a little bit more over the next month or so, because again, I would struggle if we went back to the alien scenario. I would struggle to explain DeAndre Yedlin as more than a player for a not very good Premier League team who is very fast. And he's proven himself. He's proven himself to a manager in Rafa Benitez, who obviously has a very long resume and a very successful resume at that. So there's obviously something there. But I still, when I find myself watching him or when I do see him, it tends to be him taking an odd pursuit angle or not closing off a spot that he should have closed off that leads to a goal, or turning his back and giving away handballs. And there's just these kind of moments of defensive naivete almost that I would expect to have seen reduced at this point, and they're still kind of there. But that might just be because I'm only focusing on those negative highlights, and maybe if I watch a little bit more, overall, we'll see him evolving. So that's my optimistic take on why I'm going to try to watch a little bit more Newcastle, not just because they have Miguel Almiron.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you on that. I think I actually have it written down in my notes that maybe the most interesting storyline for March and for those next U.S. national team friendlies is Yedlin. Mm-hmm. And I think really looking at his role and how he could fit, what does he warrant it? Does he not warrant it? I think there are some really good questions to ask there. And so I'll be paying attention to Newcastle and Yedlin as well.
And let's stick with the defense then, because some other names in there. It felt like it was going to be nailed on that it's always going to be John Brooks and it's always going to be Matt Miazga as two of your center backs if you're playing, or the two center backs if you're playing in a back four, and then two of the three if you've got more of a back three. But I've been a little bit more on the fence about Matt Miazga lately. Should we feel good that he's back playing in England, or do we make more of the situation that happened at the end of his time in France as maybe he can't handle different things when they're thrown at him?
I think Miazga getting out of France is probably just a win in itself. And so he ended up playing for Reading, who are pretty close to the bottom of the championship. So I think this is still a good opportunity for Miazga, right? He has an opportunity to help Reading get out of the relegation zone as best he can, keeping clean sheets or allowing as few goals as possible. But I think, getting back to England and just getting out of France in that bad situation apparently that he was in, mm-hmm. not that, he wasn't a little bit culpable for that probably, but I think getting at least a semi-stable, as stable as a relegation threatened championship team can be, environment is a decent thing for Miazga right now. And mm-hmm. my thing is, I just really like to see Chelsea sell him in the summer and get him a permanent or at least semi-permanent home. I mean, he's been around so many different places in the last few years, and I think he would do really well to have more of a stable environment. So I don't know. What do you think about Miazga, Taylor?
I mean, I'm with you there. I was about to ask you, who do you think is closer to a starting 11, him or somebody else? But you've kind of answered it there with selling him. I think it's just that because of the kind of blip in France where maybe this is again my ignorance showing, but I don't think of France outside of PSG and Lyon and a few other teams as being the most you're just bombarded by amazing attackers week in and week out in these incredible attacking systems. And so I kind of expected him to go there and sort of be successful and start every game and continue to kind of rise up the rankings. And that he didn't. I can't claim to have watched every game in France. I can't claim to have watched most games in France. But it just felt like a sort of, he came across this obstacle. And yes, there's an issue with the coaching system and some other outside areas as well. But it just was surprising to me that it didn't work out, and it gave me a little more concern than I thought I would have. And I think it's maybe just because I thought he would be a lockdown for sure starting center back for the U.S. national team for years to come, that when there is that moment of uncertainty, it then makes things seem that much more worse because it felt like an issue that was dealt with. If you remodel your home starting with this one thing, and then that one thing starts to break down a little bit, you start to wonder uh-oh, am I in that was the one thing I thought I dealt with, and now here we are asking questions. So maybe it's more that. Maybe it's more the kind of intangibles of the situation rather than anything relating to his performance. So if we continue to see him get minutes for Reading, and then maybe it does end up with hopefully I'm with you, like a permanent move somewhere. Maybe Reading just come in and say like, hey, we'll offer that money. Even if it means playing in the championship, at least it means playing consistent minutes and maybe developing his game further.
I really am a fan of Miazga in general, kind of like you were saying. I think, or I thought he would be this, star center back for the U.S. national team, and I think he's still probably one of the closest things we have to that. So I'm really just hoping that he can find himself a stable environment and get consistent minutes for a decent enough team and eventually translate some solid performances to the national team.
And in that partnership with Brooks, like, what do you think he brings to the table? Because as you said earlier, Brooks is very calm on the ball. He looks like one of our more composed, kind of overall polished center backs. What about Miazga?
Miazga, I think, in addition to his passing ability, which is pretty good in what I've seen of him, he's comfortable on the ball and splitting lines with his passes and things like that. Not on the same level as Brooks, but still decent enough. I think Miazga could end up doing a pretty good job of covering for some of Brooks' deficiencies. Actually, I have some concerns about Brooks's defensive work, which is kind of important for a center back most of the time. Brooks can be a little bit suspect in space when he has to defend in space, and I think Miazga is definitely better than that. Not perfect by any stretch, but he can cover ground pretty well and defend in space. So I think Miazga has the potential to be a pretty good partner for Brooks. Maybe even a guy like Aaron Long would be a good name to mention to go alongside Brooks. But Miazga, I think, is pretty well rounded and could end up doing a good job of covering for his potential partner and Brooks's deficiencies as well.
Hey everybody, this is Taylor jumping in. I don't want to deprive you of Joseph's knowledge, but I did want to let you know about today's sponsor, and I wanted to let you know by talking about Seinfeld, strangely enough, because I've been watching reruns of Seinfeld lately, and I've been looking at George Costanza's hair, and I keep thinking, if only George knew about Hims. That's because 66% of men lose their hair by the age of 35. But 4hims.com is a one-stop shop for hair loss, skincare, sexual wellness for men. They can help with that hair loss. If only Costanza had known he wouldn't have had to spend whole seasons wearing a rug and covering it up and putting on Timberlands so he looked taller. He could have just gotten the treatment he needed at an affordable price. When you start to notice your hair loss, though, it is too late. So maybe it would have been too late for George. It's easier to keep the hair you have than to replace the hair you've lost. So if that hairline is slowly starting to move backwards, or you've noticed some bald spots, maybe you just find like someone staring at the back of your head and now you have questions. Well, you can go to 4hims.com. They connect you with real doctors and medical grade solutions to treat hair loss. They provide well-known generic equivalents to name brand prescriptions to help you keep your hair. No snake oil pills, no gas station counter supplements. I think in one episode George turned purple from taking non-approved medicine. That will not happen either because, again, these are medical grade solutions. So our listeners can get a trial month of Hims for just $5 today, right now, while supplies last. See the website for full details. This would cost hundreds if you went to a doctor or a pharmacy, but instead you can go to 4hims.com/total soccer. That's FORHIMS.com/total soccer, which is all one word, all uppercase, if you were wondering. 4hims.com/total soccer to get that trial month for just $5 right now. So thank you to Hims for sponsoring today's episode. And now back to Joe. And what about Cameron Carter-Vickers? What are the shortcomings there that might hold him back from maybe getting like a starting spot with Tottenham next season?
I just have one word written under CCV in my notes, and it's just passing.
Yeah.
His passing is always so suspect. I mean, not always. That's unfair to CCV, but his passing is not consistent. He doesn't even look. He doesn't typically look comfortable on the ball for Swansea. He's just not as clean as probably you'd like a national team center back to be for the United States. I think, obviously, not the greatest competition for the U.S. in the recent friendlies, but Zimmerman looked pretty clean on the ball in his passing ability, and Long looked decent on the ball as well. And I think probably both of those guys have jumped over CCV in the national team center back depth chart. So that's kind of my take on CCV. If he ends up developing into a really good passer to couple with, his I guess is solid enough speed for a big guy and his defensive ability, then maybe we do see him back with the national team. But I'm a little bit hesitant at this point.
So we have CCV in the championship. We have Matt Miazga in the championship. We have Tim Ream with Fulham, currently 19th in the Premier League. We'll see what ends up happening there with the rest of the season. But of those three, who do you think is like the championship is the appropriate level for? Like maybe they've kind of found that level, that's where it fits for them. And who do you think like genuinely either does belong in the Premier League or could handle life in the Premier League with maybe a team that isn't going to get relegated?
I think CCV is probably in the right spot at this point in his career. I don't think he's good enough for the Premier League. Miazga, I'm pretty high on still, so I think he could probably handle it. I don't know if the Premier League would be the right spot for him right now, but that doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And I think Ream is probably capable of playing in the Premier League. I can't say I've watched a ton of Fulham this season. But again, Ream is always pretty clean on the ball, and I really like that in center back. So I think Ream and Miazga are probably the two I would say up in the Premier League and CCV in the championship.
All right, and then moving further north of the Premier League, let's move to Scotland, shall we? Timothy Weah continued to get minutes as Celtic advanced past St Johnstone in the Scottish FA Cup. I felt weird just writing FA Cup, so I wrote Scottish FA Cup instead. 3 goals in 7 appearances, only 2 starts. What do you think success looks like for him at Celtic? And I guess maybe more specifically, but slightly more generally, what do you think the best case scenario is for him at the end of this season? And maybe what's the most realistic scenario for him at the end of the season?
So starting with that first question, I think going into his time with Celtic, I would have said, getting on the field, getting a few starts here and there, scoring a few goals. I'd say that's a pretty successful little stint with Celtic. But now it's almost like Tim Weah has gone out there and really raised all of our expectations. I expect him to keep getting more and more appearances and more minutes and more starts for Celtic, and at this point to keep scoring goals. So I think that's sort of what I'm expecting from Weah, and I think what would be a successful loan stint with Celtic. I think he's proven at this point that he can play out wide, he can play up. Mm-hmm. I really like him at both spots. So I think overall I've been impressed with his time at Celtic, and I think he's done a good job of sort of elevating himself. And at least I'm sure Tim Weah is out there playing and scoring for Celtic just so that I'll be proud of him. But I think he's done really well. And so then looking at the second part was realistic expectations and ideal expectations for after the season. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think probably what's a realistic expectation for Weah, he'll go back to PSG and maybe train a little bit before the season starts, and then probably get another loan somewhere. Maybe this time it's to Liga, and he gets to a mid-table sort of French team, and he does well there. I think that is probably a realistic expectation. My ideal expectation for Weah is, he scores a ton of goals for Celtic, and either he ends up getting another loan. I don't know. Actually, I think my realistic expectation and my ideal expectations are probably the same. Mm-hmm. I think getting him back closer to PSG, maybe. I'm not sure he'll ever break into that team, so maybe that doesn't matter too much. But moving sort of up another ladder in terms of his competitive, the team he's on in their level, I think would be a really great step for him.
I did find myself wondering when the Lucho Acosta rumors were happening, and now all the stories have come out about all the injuries they're dealing with. I did find myself wondering if maybe they'll look at him this summer as depth that they can't afford to not have around. But I think you're right. It probably ends up being another loan move. It's interesting to me that And I think I would agree with it, but that you didn't go with the maybe get a permanent move to Celtic. Why do you think it is that or do you think it's the case that staying with Celtic or staying in the SPL wouldn't necessarily help him?
It's funny because I almost did say it would be a good situation for him to get a permanent move to Celtic, but it's probably too early to make this assumption. But is it possible that Tim Weah is already too good for Celtic? It's almost definitely too early to say that, but it's sort of in the back of my mind. If he keeps really, I think he's excelling there. I think he really is doing well. Yeah. So maybe he's ready for the next step after this season. So that was sort of my reasoning for that.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me, because even if he's not too good for Celtic, he might be too good for most of the rest of the league, which then not necessarily going to help you kind of raise that game or challenge yourself week in and week out against superior opposition. But I don't know if that's necessarily the case for Matt Polster at Rangers. Has not gotten minutes yet. What should our expectations for him be, do you think, this season and beyond?
So I'm not overly familiar with Rangers, but I think I don't think it would be unrealistic to expect him to get minutes at right back. Or I mean, I know he likes to slide a little bit, and we see him in midfield occasionally. But I think I'll be more surprised. I'll be more surprised than not if we don't see Polster get on the field for Rangers this season. So on the whole, he's kind of an interesting player. I was reading Brian Sharetta's breakdown of him recently, and Polster talks about in that interview how he likes to come inside, and I think he probably was looking at that Nick Lima role for Berhalter on the national team and saying, "Oh, I could probably do that." So I think Polster's in a hopefully to start getting some minutes this season and maybe popping back up on the national team radar.
All right. Another player who has popped in and out of the national team radar would be Andrija Novakovic. He got his 5th goal of the season earlier today, Fortuna Sittard, currently comfortably mid-table in the Eredivisie in the Netherlands. Would you like to see him getting more chances with the U.S. national team? And what do you think he would maybe bring to the U.S. Team?
So I think the issue with Novakovic getting a lot of looks for the national team or getting in camp, it was just the number of other guys that they have that could play that spot. So we've already kind of talked about Josie Altidore and Bobby Wood, Josh Sargent, and then I like Tim Weah as a potential 9 option as well. And then you've got Zardes and Ramirez maybe sort of also at that level, not quite at that level, but right underneath perhaps. So I personally am kind of a fan of Novakovic's game. He's pretty crafty on the ball. He's a big guy. He's got deceptive speed. I don't think he's going to necessarily to backline like Zardes would. But overall, he's a decent player, and I'd like to see more of him with the national team. I'm just not sure that we will.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair summary because and across the board it was fair because even in the goal today, but in goals past and in just moments I've seen from him. He is much more comfortable on the ball than I would have expected. The goal today was sort of a dribbly, feint, and then shoot and score. But it's not for his size. I do often expect it to be much more like poacher, fox in the box, getting on the end of crosses. And so to see him with the ball at his feet and look kind of comfortable, I think is what appeals to me. And then I think it gets into more of the issue of if Greg Berhalter is looking for somebody like Gyasi Zardes to do Gyasi Zardes things and make runs in behind and kind of make those kind of darting runs that are going to cause problems or break the offside line. I don't know if that fits Novakovic quite as much. So then maybe it is for him, it's if we're looking for a different system or a different style or a sort of change him up Alan Gordon style, even though maybe he's not necessarily going to win all the headers, maybe then he gets some looks. But I'm with you that it feels like right now he's kind of fallen, or not even fallen, but just kind of is further down the depth chart.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on in terms of sort of categorizing him as a different type of player than that guy making the runs like Zardes. We would see maybe Tim Weah also is good at that sort of thing. So I think you're right. If Berhalter decides to change up his striker profile and maybe that's where Altidore factors in a little bit when we see him eventually, maybe Novakovic is sort of like that understudy in a weird way. It's kind of, in my brain, it's a little bit weird to think of Altidore and Novakovic in this category, but I think they're closer together probably than other players at that position. So yeah, Novakovic will be an interesting one. I know it would be really nice to see him score a little bit more consistently in the Eredivisie because I know he was out for a little bit with injuries. I think back before Christmas or November or whenever it was, but he still hasn't been a consistent scorer. So it would be nice to see him keep getting on that score sheet and keep doing damages against Eredivisie defenses and see what Berhalter thinks of him. Yeah,
that's a really good point because for me, criticizing Matt Miazga for not locking it down in a league not known for having like the strongest attack across the board, the Eredivisie is not known for having the best defenses, and that he has only scored 5 and I think 17. It's a good point. You probably want a little bit more consistency from him. Maybe not even necessarily Josie Altidore or Aaron Johansson levels, but you'd like to see a few more goals before he gets into that conversation. So then let's go to the opposite side of the field, because one who I think Daryl and I keep forgetting about when we talk goalkeepers or potential starting goalkeepers is Ethan Horvath. Where do you think he fits in sort of the depth chart for Greg Berhalter? Is he competing for the top spot, or do you think he's closer to competing for the number 3 spot?
I think he's probably closer to competing for that number 3 spot, and it's a little bit sad because we saw Horvath almost stand on his head in that was it the Stave Sirikin friendly against Italy? Was that the one where he made a whole bunch of saves and it was really actually fun to watch him play goalkeeper. But I went back and watched Ethan Horvath recently. try to pass, and it's not pretty. It's not pretty, Taylor. So that's kind of my quibble with Ethan Horvath is he's just not a good distributor from the back. That's so important for Berhalter. I was talking with Zach Steffen in the training camp leading up to the game against Panama for the national team. He was talking about, he's used to receiving the ball, maybe even more than the center back in Columbus, and then now with the national team, we see. I think that was I can't remember. Was it Leget's goal in Costa Rica where the pole play started from Steffen with a long ball from the back? It just distribution is so important to the style that Berhalter wants to play. So I'm a little bit hesitant about Horvath's role at all with the national team, but I do think if he's competing for a spot, it's probably for that third goalkeeper spot.
All right, and we've talked about a lot of different names. Is there anybody else that you have on your list or that you would want to talk about or you talked about in that article? We haven't talked about Kenny Saif, Jonathan Amon, Roman Saiz, but I think the reason being there is because for me personally, to be honest, I have not seen really anything from them in the last month or so. Not that they haven't done anything, but I just haven't watched it. So I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable speculating, but I wasn't sure if there was anybody else who you thought we hadn't yet addressed who is playing outside of Major League Soccer who maybe might get some looks or is worth discussing.
Yeah, I think there's one guy. I'd like to at least mention his name, Dwayne Holmes for Derby County. I think we're starting to see a little bit more buzz about him, which is kind of encouraging because when I watch him, he's an exciting player. I think he's a pretty versatile guy from what I've seen. I think he probably plays a little bit more midfield than he does out wide or at right back for Derby County. But I saw a pass from him, and probably if you're listening to this, you might have seen it too. A pretty nice low driven ball onto the end of a diagonal run from one of his teammates, and he puts it right in the box, right at the perfect spot for his teammate, and eventually they score from that play. And it's exciting. I think Holmes has a really good change of pace in the attack. He's crafty. He's creative on the ball. So I'd be hopeful that we might see him and maybe we can see him if he impresses, and maybe we even see him on the field a little bit for the U.S.
So I had kind of completely forgotten about Dwayne Holmes. By the way, if you're Googling him, it's Duane Holmes, Holmes with an L, like Sherlock. But I think part of the reason why I'd completely forgotten him is because he has been around so long. I think I wrote about him for Paste 4 years ago. And so when you mentioned him now, or 3 years ago, so then when you mentioned him now, I was thinking oh, he's what, 29 or 30? He's 24 years old. I just pulled up his profile. So and he turned 24 relatively recently. So he is one who, I think maybe isn't on my radar. But the more I kind of look at his stats and everything that he brings to the table, from what you're saying, the more I'm okay, Dwayne Holmes, I'll watch some Derby games. Let's get it going.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think his name kind of reemerging a little bit is nice to see, because the more midfield and attacking depth the U.S. has, the capable of coming in and start a CONCACAF qualifier. So I'm firmly on the let's hope Dwayne Holmes is an elite talent train. I don't necessarily think he'll ever amount to quite that billing, but I think it's exciting to see Holmes start to get more and more appearances for Derby County in the championship, and who knows, maybe we'll see him called up in March.
Well, when Frank Lampard takes over Chelsea next season and Dwayne Holmes signs for 70 million pounds, I'll be sure to pull that excerpt out and send it to you. So you can look forward to that.
Perfect.
You can look forward to that, Joseph.
I will absolutely look forward to that.
But until then, I look forward to reading more of your work for The Athletic. It's been very good, and it really is. I read, I'm I got to have him back on to talk about this. Is usually how it goes. So thank you for writing such compelling stuff.
Well, thank you for reading and for complimenting me on air.
Of course, of course. And if people want to hear more from you, I'm assuming the easiest way for them to find you would be Twitter. So can you remind us all your Twitter account one more time?
Yeah, Twitter is the easiest. At Cleats on Twitter is my handle. And then if you want to read some of my The Athletic is the spot to go for that.
There we go. So at Joe and Cleats, go to The Athletic. But Joe, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Absolutely, Taylor. I had a blast. Thanks for having me on.